General History of Africa. Methodology and African Prehistory. UNESCO General History of Africa. Volume I Methodology and African Prehistory Editor J. K. Serbo Volume I Ancient Civilizations of Africa Editor G. Mokhtar Volume I Africa from the 7th to the 11th Century Editor M. LFAC Assistant Editor IHRBF Volume IV Africa from the 12th to the 16th Century Editor D.T.9 Volume V Africa from the 16th to the 18th Century Editor B. 8. Ogot Volume V I Africa in the 19th Century until the 1880s Editor JFAJ Volume V I Africa under Colonial Domination 1880 to 193 5 Editor 8. 8. Bohan Volume V I Africa since 1935 Editor 8. 8. Masrui Assistant Editor C. 1G. UNESCO International Scientific Committee for the Drafting of a General History of Africa. General History of Africa. Methodology and African Prehistory Editor J. KZRBO. Heinemann CALIFORN IAUNDSCO. First published 1981 by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. 7 Place D. Fonte. 75,700 Paris and Heinemann Educational Books Limited 22 Bedford Square, London sub 3HH. Reprinted in 1992 and 1995 by Heinemann Educational Publishers, a division of Heinemann Publishers Oxford Limited, Holly Court, Jordan Hill, Oxford Box 28 EJ. Reprinted in 2000 by UNESCO Publishing 1 Room Iolis, 75,732 Paris Edex 15, France PMB 5205, Biba.po Box 10,103, Village Post Office, Gaborone, Florence, Prague, Paris, Madrid, Athens, Melbourne, Johannesburg, Auckland, Singapore, Tokyo, Chicago, Sao Paulo. First published 1981 in the United States of America by the University of California Press 2223 Fulton Street, Berkeley, California 94720. United States of America. Copyright UNESCO 198 I. Heinemann Publishers ISBN 435-94807-5 Cast ISBN 435-94808 Paper UNESCO ISBN 9023-101-707-1 University of California Press ISBN 0520-03912 LCN 78-57321. Film set in IIPB Monophoto Airtart by Northumberland Press Limited, Gateshead, Tyne and Ware. The Prehistory of North Africa. LBALOUD. The nearness of the countries of the Maghreb to Europe and their Mediterranean seaboard made them an early target for prehistoric research, some of it dating back to over a century ago. A substantial bibliography resulted, the reliability of which was highly variable. It was subsequently clarified and narrowed down 1952, 1955, 1974, but research into the prehistory of this part of North Africa did not keep the lead it had gained for long. It has, on the contrary, fallen behind in two important respects: excavation methods apart from all too rare exceptions, and absolute chronology, here essentially limited to radiocarbon dating. In East Africa, infinitely greater progress has been made in these respects. The result is that the lack of lower Pleistocene human fossils, of dates for Paleolithic occupation sites obtained by the potassium-argon dating method, has meant that we are only able to date hominid settlements in the Maghreb and the Sahara through hypothetical correlations of the fauna and the typology of stone industries. Without more and fuller stratigraphical material, it has been difficult to establish the continuity of human occupation, highly probable though it was. Type sites are isolated both in time and in space. Ternidine Atlanthropus in Algeria is an example. The problems of the Mousterian, of its connection with the Aterian, of the human type that was the bearer of the latter culture, of the transition from the Aterian to the Ibero-Maurusian, of Capsian stratigraphy and of the stages of Neolithization, are largely unsolved. Prehistoric research has provided important insights into the Quaternary era, stratigraphy, paleontology, and has made it possible to establish a typology reaching beyond the confines of the Maghreb. It should henceforth adopt a paleoethnological approach, MBN in his environment rather than MBN and his environment. The earliest human industries, the Pre-Acheulean, there is no lack of evidence, but it is difficult to interpret other than typologically. interpretation has been based on the stratigraphy of the coastal quaternary in Morocco, Biberson animal paleontology in Algeria, the prehistory of North Africa in Anak, near Sétif, excavated by C. Berge and in Tunisia and Brim, near Kidali and solely on typology in the Sahara region, in Afdali, etc. A somewhat tenuous link up with the Tanzanian, Kenyan and Ethiopian sites can thus be inferred, tenuous because the Atlantic coast of Morocco provided the only evidence for the evolution of the pebble tools used by P. Biberson as the basis for his conclusions, some of which are now challenged, because the fauna are not necessarily contemporary, because we are confronted with an archaeological presence on the one hand, and with archaeological structure on the other, because the methods of typological analysis vary from French-speaking to English-speaking Africa, and so on. It seems unlikely at this stage of our knowledge that hominids were present in the Maghreb and the Sahara as early as in eastern and southern Africa. There has been no identification of the flake industries preceding the pebble tools, there is no trace of an osteodontoceramic culture, nor are there remains of Australopithecines. W.E. do, however, have every reason to believe that the pebble culture of Morocco, Algeria and the Sahara coincides chronologically with the Oldaway industries, that is, that it dates back to between 2 and 1 million years ago /million if the bifacially flamed pebble is taken into consideration. Investigations have therefore necessarily concentrated on correlating the chronostratigraphy and typological evolution. It has given rise to a compilation of typological lists with chronological implications, as is testified by the work of P. Biberson in Morocco, H. Hugot and L. Romano in the Central Sahara, H. Alama and J. Chaballon in the Western Sahara. Their analyses are founded on technical characteristics, the repetition of which has made it possible to establish systematic patterns. The HE order of classification proceeds from the simple to the complex, unifacial, bifacial, polyhedral flaking. This classification corresponds in all probability to a chronological sequence. Patterns of at least regional validity have been reconstructed by P. Biberson for the quaternary beaches of the Mirage and Atlantic seaboard, and J. Chaballon for deposits in the Sahara. Paleontology provided the basis for placing the 8 faceted spheroids in the evolutionary process of Villafranchian fauna as it is known from Morocco throughout Algeria, in Boucherite, in Anak Tunisia, Lake Irshkaoul, in Brim. Generally speaking, we base our assumptions on a stratigraphical analysis of the Villafranchian based largely on animal paleontology. It is in this sequence that human industries appeared, and their evolution towards the bifacial tools and hand axes of the classical Lower Paleolithic can be proved, but nowhere is there an archaeological structure, and hence a paleontological frame, as there is in Tanzania, Oldaway, Kenya, or Ethiopia. 569. Methodology and African Prehistory. The Acheulean industries since the Burg-Wartenstein Symposium 1965 and the Dakar Pan-African Prehistoric Conference 1967. The entire Lower Paleolithic has been grouped together as the African Acheulean, which coincides in Western Europe with the Abyssinian and the Acheulean, but also the Clactonian and the Levalloisian, both of which are the subject of a great deal of controversy. Examples of the Acheulean in the Maghreb are plentiful. Apart from surface sites, it is to be found in 3 characteristic types of site, 1 those relating to the coastal, continental and even marine quaternary. This is the case particularly on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, where P. Biberson has been able to suggest an Acheulean sequence starting from the pebble tools of the pre-Acheulean pebble culture through to the Middle Paleolithic Quaternary. For reasons connected with its coastal geomorphology, Algeria has not proved so well endowed, but deposits have been located on the Kabylian coast Djajeli and near the Knob Bone. I am not aware of any Acheulean sites of this kind on the Tunisian coast. 2 sites in River Rhine and lacustrine alluvial deposits. The HE former are far scarcer and poorer than in Europe, and their stratigraphical and paleontological relations are more often than not extremely imprecise. This is true of a number of Moroccan Oudmela and Algerian sites Ouzadain, near Tlemcen, Champlain, near Media, Tomlithoud Sebe Mansour Constantine Clare Fontaine north of Tebelsa Esbaikil, and, particularly, Elma El Abiad south of Tebelsa. In Tunisia there is the Acheulean of Redif Gatsa. Lakeshore sites scarcely bear mentioning beside the spectacular examples in East Africa, e.g. Salé, Kenya. Although there is late Kerarch Lemsand where excavations were conducted rather too long ago, and badly, by Boole, and Abukir Mustabadem, which is even less well known. There is only one site which stands out amidst this uncertainty, and that is Sides in Lekef, Tunisia, where a layer containing hand axes was found between two other layers containing bifaceted artifacts but no hand axis. On the other hand, the Shulian assemblages in lacustrine deposits are COMMON from Mauritania to Libya. 3 sites associated with former artesian springs, which appear to have attracted MEN from the Shulian to the Atiran. Examples are Tibnabil Casablanca and Amphratis south of Oudiaga in Morocco, Lake Kerar, which we have already mentioned, in Algeria, as well as Chetma Biskra, which we know almost nothing about, and above all Turnafine Mascaret. Only the last named has been excavated recently 1954-6 and thoroughly, by Professor C. Berge, commissioned by the Algerian authorities. But we 570. The prehistory of North Africa should not draw over hasty conclusions. The industry is extremely interesting, the fauna are exceptionally rich, and it was here Pathlanthropus was discovered, but the stratigraphy of this remarkable site presents a problem, leaving too broad a chronological span in which to place the finds, possibly the very nature of the site, with the constant disturbance of the sand by the artesian upwellings, made it impossible to establish a chronostratigraphy. It has not been proved. A study of the tools would suggest that what was here was not tool-making workshops but more probably the regular hunting of animals coming to water. The Maghribian and Saharan Acheulean is not fundamentally different from the Acheulean as it was formerly defined in France. The HE methods of analysis boards, 1961 and Belout, 1967 do not indicate any basic difference in the bifacial tools. The HE same is true of trihedral implements. The presence of flakes and of a small industry, at Turnafine for instance, comes as no surprise. The HE soft HMMER came into use towards the end of the early Acheulean for shaping or reshaping. Only one specimen has been found at Turnafine bifacial. We also find the characteristic tranchette marks in the shaping of the working tips of trihedrons. The most original feature, which has long been emphasized, is the importance of flanked cleavers. It is stretching the point to suggest that it was a strictly African implement, a sort of chopping tool. In fact, it is not always present in the African Acheulean and has not been found in the admirable El Mael Abiad assemblage, to take only one example, in Algeria, but it does exist from the Near East to the Indian Peninsula. Its presence in Spain, Rio Manzanares, near Madrid and across the Pyrenees has led H. Alamet in a very recent investigation 1975 to consider the question of how the Straits of Gibraltar were crossed well before Neolithic navigation. It has been concluded that there was an isthmus, caused partly by shallow water conditions, which became practicable during the Riss regressions. The most relevant typological analysis of the Maghribian hand axis is that made by J. Teixeira. TWO conclusions are of crucial importance. The first is the appearance, from as far back as the early Acheulean, of the Levallois stoneworking technique, leading to the incredibly widespread standardization of the so-called Tibelbala Tatriangi cleavers western Algerian Sahara. The HE second is the technique of flaking from a cord, which made it possible to produce bifacial flakes with a perfectly sharp cutting edge. The KOMBEW, the technique of southern Africa. Were these highly elaborate techniques transmitted from Africa to Europe, where the first of the two, at least, played a significant role up to the Middle Paleolithic? The definition of the Acheulean has always been expressed in archaeological terms. The HE industries associated with bifacial tools span to glaciations Mindel, Riss, the interglacial between them and the interstadials into which they are subdivided. Biberson has sought to equate them with marine transgressions and regressions. Marian equals Mindel. 571. Methodology and African prehistory. Amphibian equals Riss. 1050 N equals Riss. These correlations are still speculative. The prolongation into the Riss WERM interglacial is perfectly plausible. For want of absolute dating, we must base our theories on paleontology. The four lose their remaining upper Villafranchian components and become, in Aramberge's words, the great Chadu Zambesian fauna, although we might add that we know nothing yet of the microfauna or the flora of Turnafine. The Atlanthropus found at Turnafine, and those discovered in Morocco Rabat MEN and Sidi Abderrahmani Casablanca MEN belong to the genus Homo erectus. It is difficult to date these specimens of Pithecanthropus, which are in fact close to Sinanthropus pichiensis, with any accuracy. At least 400,000,500,000 years ago seems the most plausible hypothesis. Elsewhere, they had mastered the use of fire and possibly had a crude form of language. The Maghreb supplies us with no additional data in this field. Musteri and A.T. written in 1955 one wrote that I doubted the existence of an autonomous Mousterian in North Africa. Dr. Gobber took me up sharply on this, and he was right in doing so. I subsequently 1965 modified my judgment appreciably, but the problem was not solved, it was merely shifted. There were undoubtedly truly Mousterian sites in the Maghreb, but their geographical distribution was extraordinary, quite contrary to any accepted conception of prehistoric ethnic unity. 6 sites beyond dispute in Tunisia: Sides in Likaf in Madada Kerwade in Metkerchum DJ, Chambi Sidi Manzar D. Gatsa, Elder Gatsa Utakirat Gabes. Only one in Algeria, Rit Amiakali Valley 3 in Morocco, the Aforal Tudia Ga Kitfon Belgamani Tasa Jabal Ir Houd Safi. None in the Sahara. There are, however, hundreds of or post-Mousterian sites. This does not reflect the state of research, for the discovery of the Mousterian was a central preoccupation of prehistorians trained in France, where it abounds, as it does in the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, as far south as Gibraltar for example. Sides in Likaf is 800 kilometers from Rutamia, the latter 360 from the Diaforal Cave, and Diaforal another 700 from the Jabal Ir Hound. Yet we have here typical Mousterian, comparable to the European facies, and in particular to the Lavoisian flaking technique. The ND at each geographical extreme we have the human evidence, the Neanderthals of Jabal Ir Hound and the earliest ritual monument yet discovered, the cairn or Hermaean of Algder, of which only the summit emerges from the spring to which it was no doubt dedicated. With the exception of the Outakirat, no indisputably Mousterian site is near the coast. But where was the shore of the Gulf of Gabes at that time? The Maghribian Mousterian can only have come from the east. But the most remarkable thing is that this Mousterian developed in a very short time in a most original manner. It gave way to the Atiri and in situ, basing my deductions upon rigorous application. 572. The Prehistory of North Africa. Of geological rules of classification, I had regarded as Atirian those Mousterian industrial complexes in which Atirian peduncular points were found: Algder, Ai and Metkerchum, and so on. I do not think that this is proof that Mousterian and Atirian were contemporary. I believe that the Maghribian Mousterian developed differently from all the other Mousterian traditions. J. Teixeira has shown beyond doubt that it was not a matter of adding peduncular points or scrapers, but of transforming some 30 Mousterian tool forms into Atirian forms by making a peduncular base. In Europe, especially in France, the Mousterian tradition developed differently. The Maghribian development is so original that a distinct definition was adopted, but this is no longer tenable. The Atirian is only an evolved facies of the Mousterian characteristic of a part of Africa, and it coincides with the Mousterian, even chronologically. Our Warfree's definition of an Upper Paleolithic Atirian is, in essence, no longer valid. Some of the early writers had already suggested the existence of a Mousterian with peduncular artifacts, just as we today use the term Mousterian with denticulate artifacts. And, since the industry from the eponymous site of the Atirian Oujabana, near Per El Ater, south of Tabelsa, was never thoroughly analyzed by its discoverer, Atirian is still, as M. Antoine put it, a nomen nudum. Since, moreover, it is an early development from the Mousterian, covering an extremely broad lifespan and spreading through the Maghreb and from the northern to the southern Sahara, it coincides chronologically with part of the Middle Paleolithic and at least the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. But there is still very little precise chronological evidence to go by. G. Camp's proposition concerning a possible correlation with McBurney's dating in Cyrenaica is tenuous, for there is no positive evidence that the industries are related. The Atirian is highly debatable. Camp's and the Ibero-Maurusian non-existent Teixeira. Stratigraphical relations with the continental or marine quaternary have been established both in the Sahara and the Maghreb, and both in relative and absolute chronology. The HE 40th millennium before our era is doubtless not the earliest date to which the beginning of the Aterian can be assigned. The difficulty arises over the limits of the reliability of carbon-14 dating. But the dates produced in the Maghreb and the Sahara are between 37000 and 30000 before our era and constitute a coherent, plausible sequence. In its beginnings, the Aterian is thus early Middle Paleolithic. It is subsequently contemporary with the Castelperronian and the Aurignacian, that is, the early stage of the Upper Paleolithic, in France at least. Its relationship with Quaternary formations is consistent. There are cases where Aterian implements have been found, in their original condition, in the Neoterranian beaches which had just emerged as a result of the beginning of the last great regression, for example, at Karouba, near Mastadam, western Algeria. The end of this Vremen interstadial WRM1/2 had occurred around 48,000 before our era. The continental, generally rubified, formations, rich in Aterian, under 573 methodology and African prehistory, which these beaches now lie, far below the present sea level. They date back to the regression which probably reached some 150 meters. Assigning a date to the end of the Aterian is a far more complicated task. That it spread over the entire Sahara is an established fact. Another fact is the technological development of the industry towards forms that more or less heralded the Neolithic. According to Hugot, the Aterian spread no farther than the great diatomaceous lakes which were full until the 7th millennium before our era. There is no positive evidence of this pre-Neolithic Aterian, however attractive the proposition may be. However, no trace of an intermediate industry has yet been discovered, and the main obstacle, one of paleoanthropology, is in the process of disintegrating. Very recent finds in Morocco give way to the theory that Aterian MBN was not Neanderthal MBN like the Mousterians of Jebel Ir Hound, but already Homo sapiens. Upper Paleolithic and AP Paleolithic, whatever the ramifications of the Aterian MRY have been in the Sahara, in the Maghreb the sequence was different. It is unnecessary here to go back over the refutation of our Vorfree theories which for decades were regarded as being authoritative. Let us rather recapitulate the current state of our knowledge. For key ideas emerged, 1. The Idero-Maurusian, which I had already been partly responsible for distinguishing from the Capsi and for anthropological and paleoethnological reasons, is much older than was previously thought. It coincides with the French Magdalenian and is therefore an Upper Paleolithic culture. 2. The controversy over the colonial horizon, in which our Vorfree was opposed to Dr. Gobert and myself, is now settled. This blade industry, closer to the Idero-Maurusian than to the Capsian, is appreciably earlier than the latter. 3. Vorfree's definition of a typical Capsian displaced by an upper or developed Capsian has been superseded by the theory of a floodlet of Capsian industries based on a very large number of radiometric dates, not all of which are readily accepted. 4. The Neolithic of Capsian tradition proposed by Vorfree on very meager evidence but nevertheless extended by him to include a large part of Africa, must be confined to its original geographical limits, leaving the vast areas unjustifiably attributed to it to a number of other facies of the African Neolithic. The Idero-Maurusian, the definition once put forward by Polari 1909 and which is still in use, is no longer tenable. He had stressed the widespread use of 574. The prehistory of North Africa. Particular technique, the backed blade technique, which was characteristic of almost all the stone artifacts. J. Teixeir's highly detailed typological analyses finally made it possible to substitute a set of precise forms for the idea of an overall technique, as had in fact been sensed more or less strongly by a number of prehistorians, particularly Dr. Gobert in Tunisia. Fresh excavations by E. Saxon on the Tramarhat site Bihai Corniche, Algeria revealed extremely early specimens, isotopically dated, and provided more ample information on these mouflon hunters and cave dwellers living on the coast but separated from the sea by marshes and an emerged continental shelf abounding in shellfish. The Idero-Maurusian is in fact a culture occupying the coast and the Tell but which nevertheless penetrated here and there inland, the last questionable evidence of which is afforded by the Columnata site Tayeret, Algeria. However, singularly little trace of it can be found in the Tangiers region and on the coast of the Tunisian Sahel. This absence of the Ibero-Maurusian from Tunisia south of Oud Medjerda can be attributed to a separate development there, which we shall discuss below. Even a detailed analysis reveals little of note among the Ibero-Maurusian artifacts. A few hundred microburins collected sometime after the original excavations in the type site of El Amoula near Marnia, Algeria, confirmed that they were associated with the manufacture of points with a trihedral working tip called lamula points and not geometrical microliths, as in the Capsian industries. The He bone industry is extremely mediocre, with only one particularity, the trancheck. There is no personal or mural art, even though it coincided in time with Altamira and Lascaux, and Cro-Magnoid men of the Mecca-LRB type were present both to the north and the south of the Mediterranean. There is no satisfactory evidence to support the traditionally held view that this culture originated in the east, splitting into two branches, the European Cro-Magnons spreading along the northern Mediterranean and Mecca-LRB the end along the African coast to the south. Anthropologically, Amrawai perhaps be thought to descend from the Neanderthals through At and Mbn. But, however attractive this theory is, it does not explain the development of an industry which has nothing in common with the Mousterian or even the At which preceded it. To suggest that the Ibero-Maurusians were not the bearers of this culture is hardly conceivable, since it had no roots locally. And this is not the only problem. The vocation and destiny of these Maghribian Cro-Magnons were diametrically opposed to their European counterparts. Their stone industry, which coincided, at least in its early stages, with the Magdalenian, was Mesolithic to the extent that it was formerly described as a Berberoxylene. Their bone industry was far removed from the Magdalenian equivalent, and there was no personal or mural art, in spite of assertions to the contrary in Morocco. They did, however, survive until the Neolithic, even colonizing the Canary Islands, towards the end of the 3rd millennium before our era at the earliest. Other distinctive features are 575. Methodology and African prehistory. Characteristic in the Maghreb, dental mutilation, cemeteries in caves or rock shelters Al Ramel, Algeria, Viaforald, Morocco funeral monuments Columnata. The Colonial horizon and the other pre-Capsian blade industries. It has now been proved on the basis of stratigraphy and geomorphology that the blade industries of pre-Saharan Tunisia, Gafsa, Lala, Shots region, and so on were earlier than the entire Capsian sequence. At Gafsa City Manzar the colonial horizon is stratified in the alluvial fill. The final stage of lagoon sedimentation is marked by substantial gypsiferous formations. Sedimentation resumed and was then halted by the subsidence of the Gafsa basin, causing renewed erosion. The typical, developed Capsian occupies the level surfaces of this erosion as its mounts bear witness. Then though precise chronology can be established apart from the fact that there is some Mousterian in the lowermost layer of the sediment. These blade industries can only be associated with the Ibero-Maurusian in that they are specifically different from the Capsian. Their typology is different, with the exception of the backed blade technique. Their origin can no doubt be sought towards the East Cyrenaica, Egypt, Near East. Other distinctive Epipaleolithic industries can be placed locally between the Ibero-Maurusian and Capsian facies. The 7th millennium site of Columnata, with its cemetery, is characterized by its abundance of microliths. Other sites have been discovered, the largest of which is at Apkoudi at Kaiflada and Emlila, eastern Algeria, where the pre-Capsian industry also dates back to the 7th millennium before our era. The term Elassolithic has been proposed to describe this ultra-microlithic complex, which is doubtless related to an as yet undefined way of life. Other facies have been located in western Algeria, in particular the Karemian and the Crestirline, which appear to date back to the 8th millennium before our era, on the Oran coast. This list is by no means exhaustive. There was in fact a proliferation of industries between the largely Paleolithic Ibero-Maurusian and the Capsian, comparable to the Mesolithic in Europe. The Capsian facies. The Capsian sequence was the keystone of our Vorfries theories, typical Capsian, Upper Capsian and of Capsian tradition. Although this oversimplified structure has been criticized, and justifiably, with the support, more particularly, of a large number of radiometric dates, it must be conceded that research into this series has not made the headway one might have expected over the past 20 years. With a few rare exceptions, excavations in shell middens have not produced a means of identifying the stratigraphy or archaeological structure. until such time as a sufficient. 576. The prehistory of North Africa. Number of sections enable us to observe the superimposed layers of the various capsi and facies. We shall have to base our assumptions regarding contemporaneity and sequence on the carbon-14 dates, which are incomparably less reliable than its sound stratigraphy. With positive evidence in several places of the superimposing of upper capsi and untypical capsi, and this remains the basis of all classification. In both cases, the sites are heaps of miscellaneous waste matter, the mixture of ashes and charred stones, hundreds of thousands of snail shells, skeletal fragments of animals eaten by man, his lithic and bone industry, objects of ornamentation and personal art, human remains, and so on. We can allow ourselves some speculation on the hut dwellings which were the origin of these heaps of refuse. Possibly they were reed huts held together with clay. If we can judge by a fine mate, unfortunately before exact dating techniques were possible, in the region of Kenchela, eastern Algeria. The typical capsi and stone industry is usually remarkable in quality. Truncated angle burins are exceptionally frequent. Less frequent, but just as characteristic, are the long, backed blades, sometimes known as knives, the blunt edge often tinted with ochre. The backed blades make up a quarter to a third of the stone tool kits and were sometimes made by retouching burin offcuts Goberside Ellensbroids. Micro-burins were already in existence, produced not as a result of the manufacture of lamella points, as in the Ibero-Maurusian, but of the true geometric microliths trapezes, scalene triangles. The bone industry is poor. Typical capsi and has only been found within a fairly well-defined area, on either side of the Algero-Tunisian border, to the south rather than to the north of the 35th parallel. Judged by the radiometric dates, it coincided with the 7th millennium before our era but did not outlast it. It would therefore appear to coincide, within this area, with the upper capsi and, but this is at variance with known stratigraphy. I shall believe it when upper capsi and is found stratified below typical capsi and. In that case, where does the generally accepted definition of developed capsi and come in? Furthermore, we know virtually nothing of the error of typical capsi and culture. The developed capsi and is found in a flardlet of facies which spread over western Africa and at least part of the Sahara. But we should be careful not to commit the error made by R. Vorfrey in asserting the diffusion of his Neolithic of capsi and tradition over a large part of Africa on the basis of a succession of scattered finds. With the exception of what I have termed the tables and facies, still encumbered with the heavy-duty implements of the typical capsi and, the developed capsi and is an industry of small-sized artifacts, rich in geometrically shaped microliths of generally outstanding technical quality, especially the triangular and some of the trapezoid tool forms. Definitions based on statistical data are meaningless, for they are taken from museum collections, material usually inexactly selected and sorted, sporadic excavations, and artificial strata of varying thicknesses according to the 577 methodology and African prehistory whim of the excavators. One shell midden I studied at A in Dakar was occupied by MN for 1,000 years, from the middle of the 7th to the middle of the 6th millennium before our era. Can one justifiably define its industry in terms of overall statistics? The upper capsi and, or at least its southerly branch, lasted down to the 5th millennium before our era and survived until the process of Neolithization, which itself covered a very long period. It is therefore tenable that typical and upper capsi and industries coincided with the Neolithic of capsi and tradition in different areas. Capsi and culture thus lasted nearly 2,000 years, only a few centuries less than Egypt of the pharaohs. Even if we are unable to record its history, we can at least grasp its essential ethnological elements. Capsi and MN did not belong to the Cro-Magnoid type of Metaphalau. He was a Mediterranean, and the most intact, best preserved specimen, found in unquestionable stratigraphical conditions, is the MN of A in Dakar Tabelsa, who dates back to the middle of the 7th millennium before our era. Hundreds of capsi and dwellings have been found, all of which survived for centuries, and some for over a millennium. The sedentary life of these people, prior to pastoralism and agriculture, is worthy of note. Yet their dwellings were no more than huts made of reeds and branches daubed with clay or covered with hides. Hunting did not play a significant role, to judge, not by the variety of animal remains, but by their small quantities. The importance of land mollusks should not be minimized, but plant gathering played an appreciable role, and although it is tempting to draw further inferences, neither the columnated sickles nor the perforated stone balls, nor the stone mullers, nor the harvest lobster on some sickles afford proof of agriculture. Capsian man practiced a variety of burial rites, and the corpses were often found lying on their side in the fetal position. The frequent use of ochre remains a mystery. More surprising is the use of human skeletal fragments, such as the unexpected trophy skull, possibly used as a mask, discovered at Fonte in Pode, Algeria. The Capsians had already practiced dental mutilation on the living, specifically on women, up to the 8 incisors. They were nevertheless the first artists in the Maghreb. Ornaments, engraved ostrich eggshells from the typical Capsian onward, small engraved slabs, sculpted stones, which may have foreshadowed rock art. Neolithization and Neolithics. From as early as 1933 we were given a neat, systematic, uniform picture of the Neolithic by R. Vorfrey. His Neolithic of Capsian tradition, which he claimed had been diffused over the whole of the Maghreb, the Sahara and part of sub-Saharan Africa, became generally accepted theory, to the point that the initials NTC standing for Neolithic D tradition Capsian came into common use. However, Dr. Gobber and myself expressed strong doubts. 578. The prehistory of North Africa. About what we regarded as the artificial product of a piecemeal reconstruction of data which to us seemed unrelated. In fact, W.E. had not grasped the thread of Vorfrey's deductions. Why did he take the extremely mediocre site of the table D. Jodica Tunisia as his frame of reference? In his thesis 1976 c. Rubin describes how Vorfrey arrived at his conclusions. He was not interested in the Neolithic for its own sake, but wished to establish the persistence of a Capsian tradition which tailed off gradually as it moved farther away from its original source. The Neolithic was therefore no more than an epiphenomenon of the Capsian. He justified his claim regarding the broad diffusion of the NTC by superimposing the series of cultural elements which he regarded as Neolithic. This gave rise to a typological conception of the Neolithic, and did not take into account the overlying, explanatory factor in technological revolutions, the disruption of a way of life. But, in fact, the strong persistence of the Capsian tradition disproves the theory of the development of a Neolithic culture. And the projectile tips, arrowheads, found in such quantity in the Sahara, afford positive evidence of the persistence of a hunting-gathering mode of life which cannot remotely be regarded as Neolithic. In these circumstances, the Neolithic of Capsian tradition must be confined to its original frontiers. And this is what C. Rubin has done, basing his investigations on the Kapleti Grotto excavations Ors, Algeria. Next to the essential typological factors, ecology, that is, knowledge of the environment in which MBN lived, is of fundamental importance. It is therefore possible to identify a pastoral, pre-agricultural economy in which transhuman migration was practiced, which represents not the final stage of prehistory but the beginning of what are today the mountain peoples of the Ors, the Chaouis, who are small-scale shepherds and goat herds. Thus between the 5th and the 2nd millennium before our era there were a number of forms of Neolithization in the Maghreb other than the NTC sensu stricto. In the first place, the areas untouched by the Capsian influence developed separately, with certain distinctive features. The Ibero-Maurusian was superseded, and they soon came into contact with Mediterranean Europe, from as early as the 5th millennium before our era. This raises the issue of navigation. There are several coastal facies of the Neolithic, completely independent of the Capsian tradition, which give evidence of contacts with Europe by their pottery and imported obsidian. The same applies to the Mirage and Atlantic coast. On the other hand, the Neolithic of Capsian tradition cannot be extended, as Camps has suggested, to the northern Sahara, and even less to the more southerly regions of the Sahara, where we have the rock art of a Haggard and Tassili Najj. The association of rock art with the Neolithic, as proposed by Vorfrey, is, however, extremely plausible, however debatable the attribution of the Neolithic of Capsian tradition may be. Even so, this association is only 579. Methodology and African prehistory. Valid for part of the engravings, the remainder dating to protohistoric times. These early naturalistic works cannot be connected with either Europe or the Sahara, and their origin should be placed in the Neolithization of the Caspian, although the connection between the industry and the art remains to be proved. Despite the wealth of prehistoric remains in the Maghreb, its prehistory is still imperfectly understood. Progress will be made only with large-scale excavations conducted in accordance with modern scientific methods. 580. Plate 22. Pebbles fashioned into a beak-faced tool and a chopper, and Anathembotes. Plate 22.2 Spherical faceted pebbles, Anathembotes. Plate 22.3 The development of pebble culture towards Acheulean shapes. The numbers and figures refer to the system of classification used for the African pre-Acheulean industry Thembotes. 581. Plate 22.4 Hand axe found on the Acheulean site of Ergatihudain, Algerian Sahara Thembotes. Plate 22.5 Beak-faced Acheulean tool, the most advanced implement found on the Ternate site, Western Algeria Thembotes. Plate 22.6 Mousterian pointed tool, Elgder, Tunisia. Excavations led by A.I. Gruet Thembotes. 582. S. 3 greater than IM1M. Plate 22.8 Typical Caspian industry Thembotes. Plate 22.7 Atyrian tools, pedunculated points, scrapers and leveloys course, Oyug di Jufeldmal, Eastern Algeria Thembotes. Plate 22.9 Upper Caspian industry, scalene triangles, trapeziums, saws, grooved knives, burins, micro-burins, drillers, scrapers, etc. Thembotes. Plate 22.10 Upper Caspian industry, geometrical microliths, trapeziums, scalene circumflex accent, triangles, crescents and micro-burins. Thembotes. Plate 22.11 Upper Caspian, human fibula fashioned into a dagger found at Metr El Arbi, Eastern Algeria, during excavations in 1952. Thembotes. Plate 22.12 Upper Caspian, engraved limestone plaquette from Kangwet El Mouiad, Eastern Algeria. Thembotes. Plate 22.13 Neo-H thick Caspian tradition, pestle and mortar showing traces of coal poker and fragments/helix shells, found at the Mouth El Amr, Eastern Algeria. Thembotes. 584. The prehistory of the Sahara. Hahugot. The Sahara is an immense desert that covers the greater part of North Africa. It is not easy to define either its limits or its characteristics, but aridity is the factor COMMON to all its various regions. Stretching 5,700 kilometers from east to west, between the Red Sea and the Atlantic, and 1,500 kilometers from north to south, between the Pro-Saharan Atlas and the Sudanese Sahel, desert conditions now cover an area of nearly 8 to 6 million square kilometers. Yet the Sahara as we know it today has changed considerably since prehistoric times. The unifying factor in the different regions of the Sahara is the remarkably low hygrometry level, one of the lowest in the world. Apart from the extreme shortage of water, its other characteristics are wide differences between day and night temperatures and an abundance of sand, continually blown before the wind, that is fast eroding the aging relief. Although the Sahara is a desert now, it was populated extensively in several earlier periods. The departure of its last inhabitants is attributable to the increasing dryness and heat of the climate, which led to rarer rainfall and to the drying up of springs and rivers. This in turn brought about the disappearance of the plant life and the animals on which MN lived, and he was forced to retire to the fringes of the desert, where conditions were more clement. MENY experts have considered the problem of the transformation of the Sahara into a desert and the causes and consequences of this change, among them E.F. Godier, 1T. MONOD, 2 Arcapori, 3 Joules du beef, 4L. Belout, 5K. But Sir 6 and S. Hughes 7 to mention only a few. We now know in theory why a monsoon of the Gulf of Guinea and the cold polar front no longer brought to the Sahara the two opportunities for rainfall that governed. 1. E.F. Godier, 1928. 2. T. Morneau, 1945, Berg-Ortenstein Symposium, 1961. 3. Arcapori, 1953. 4. J. Dubeef, 1959. 5. Helbelout, 1952. 6. K. W. Butzer, 1958. 7. S. Hughes A. 1936, pages 19 to 22. 2. Methodology and African Prehistory. Its fertility, making it, in prehistoric times, a smiling and populous land. However, the evolution of the Saharan climate is still open to debate. We still do not know whether the deterioration of the climate has reached its peak, has still to reach it, or has perhaps passed it. Moreover, the way the desert grows is not clear. Does it spread out round the center, or do the fringes of the Sahara shift alternately between the north and the south? We are still a long way from being able to reconstruct an exact chronology for the various climatic periods which from time to time made the Sahara habitable by man. Although extensive research has been carried out in one or two directions, such works are rare and no serious effort has been made to develop them. Yet they are of capital importance, not only from the scientific point of view, but also for a better understanding of a phenomenon that affects all human life. An understanding of the climatic changes that have taken place in the Sahara during the Quaternary era is essential for the study of ecological change, and soon, when each square meter of the Earth's surface will become vital for mankind, the better the past of the Great Desert is known, the more important its role will be. The historical progress of research since the journals listing research on the prehistory of the Sahara as a whole have ceased publication, it is not easy to draw up a schedule of the work already done. We do in fact possess such lists for the colonial period, but they are incomplete and often widely scattered. Some important discoveries have, for example, been described in military reports, which are somewhat difficult of access. The political division of the Sahara also accounts for the dispersal of works devoted to its prehistoric wealth, for not only the British, French, Italians and Spaniards, but also later the Germans, Japanese, Russians and others, have all made important scientific contributions to the discovery of the Sahara's past. Yet the desert has only relatively recently been penetrated. The first serious work on the prehistory of the Sahara was probably that published by the Abbé Richard in 1869 on the Algerian Sahara. Research in Egypt began at almost the same time with a letter from A. Arcelin dated February 1867. 9. But research in the Western Sahara had hardly begun by the beginning of this century. The expeditions led by Thoreau from 1876 on contributed greatly to work on the Central Sahara, particularly the important expedition of 1898 to 1900. 11. Meanwhile, though Lentz 1-2 had remarked on the presence of prehistoric objects at Taunet in 1886. Thenceforth the study. 8. Abbé Richard, 1868, pages 74-5. 9. 8. Arcelin, in a letter to the editor of the journal, Matériels pour l'histoire primitive de l'homme, published in volume V. 1869. 10. F. Thoreau, 1883. 11. F. Thoreau, 1905. 12. O. Lentz, 1884. 586. The prehistory of the Sahara. Of Saharan prehistory attracted a fair amount of attention, and its progress was hardly impeded even by 2 world wars. Scientists have, naturally, been attracted by the wealth of prehistoric remains in the Sahara. It would be impossible to give a complete list here, but one is struck by the valuable contributions made by the earlier authorities. The work of G. B. M. Flayman, 13 Frodenis 14 and Miss G. Caton Thompson, yes, for example, is indispensable for any serious study of Saharan prehistory. Prehistoric research in the desert has been more affected than any other kind of research by momentary preoccupations. Moreover, an understanding of its particular needs was for many years obscured by the fact that it was regarded as only subsidiary to the main interests of the various trans-Saharan expeditions. So the work was entrusted to amateurs or to specialists in some other subject who could not provide the required expertise. Moreover, in such a difficult environment, where lives may depend on every pound of baggage, the bulk, weight and cumbersomeness of prehistoric evidence led to its often being left behind. It should also be added that the Sahara is not an ideal place for travelers to wander in, still less does it allow the time or the means of making detailed investigations. This probably explains the many references to non-existent industries, complete absence of stratigraphy, no menudum, and so on. In fact, the prehistory of the Sahara is as rich as that of any other region. As soon as time and money enabled specialized expeditions to investigate the Sahara, the situation changed rapidly. This occurred after the Second World War, and resulted in a number, unfortunately small, of excellent monographs that deal principally with the Haggard, the Sahara, Chad, Mauritania, the Libyan Desert, the Fezzan, and so on. A joint venture between science and industry even made possible the remarkable results recorded in the documents Scientific Missions Brigadier General Chad. Yet despite the desirability of investigating Saharan prehistory and the rich evidence available, it will be a long time before any kind of textbook is prepared. There is not even the popular account in this age, which has seen man reach the moon. All one can point to in Saharan prehistory are the many studies in detail and a few chapters in general works, in particular those of H. Alman, 17H. J. Hugot 18 and Art Warfrey, 1913. G. P.M. Flayman, 1902, pages 535 to 8, 1921, pages 114 to 15, R. Perry, 1937, list of the sites studied. 14. L. Frodenis, 1937. 15. G. Caton Thompson and E. W. Gardner, 1934. 16. H. J. Hugot, 1962. 17. H. Aliment, I. 960. 18. H. J. Hugot, 1970. 19. R. Warfrey, 1969. 587. Methodology and African Prehistory. Attempt at a chronological account from the very beginning. Saharan prehistory took its points of comparison from Europe and, in particular, from France. Such terms as Clapto-Abythilian, Chelsea-Schuline, Mousterian, Ordination Flaps and Solutrean foliate arrowheads were current. The HE errors bred by this simplistic point of view still infect Saharan studies today. Saharan prehistory, like all prehistory, grows from the analysis of detailed monographs on particular industries, and monographs of this kind have not yet been written. Another regrettable consequence of the lack of order which reigns in Saharan research is the light-hearted attribution of precise social organizations to vanished ethnic groups without any real assurance that the evidence on which they are founded is valid. TWO remarks should be made on the subject of chronology. 21st. Nowhere in the Sahara has a sufficiently comprehensive stratigraphy been found to enable us to establish a precise prehistoric succession. Secondly, apart from the Neolithic period, we have no dates that would enable us to establish an absolute chronology. However, despite these difficulties we possess such excellent studies as those of J. Chabalone on the Sahara, 22H. For on Chad, 23 P. Cameron on Mauritania, 24 backed up by 20. Quaternary chronology, a succession of varying climatic phases. In most cases we only hope to establish the relative chronology for the Sahara as it is stratigraphically so poor. One of the best comparative chronologies has been suggested by J. Chabalone. Quaternary formations of the Western Sahara, Paris, CNRS, 1964. From the base to the top of the Sahara terraces in the northwest Sahara that author distinguishes. Upper Quaternary Illafrench and Mazorian Middle Quaternary Taurushan Recent Quaternary Saharan Holocene 21. Stratigraphy, the study and interpretation of layers successively deposited in one place. It is easy to understand that a region subject to such climatological cataclysms as the Sahara should not contain much stratigraphy evidence. Sufficient stratigraphy sites do exist, however, to show that in many places there is a series of 3 terraces, old, middle and new, which testify to the existence of 3 long climatic periods. We should not over-schematize, however, for when we take microclimates into account the problem of the climatic periods that can be deduced from stratigraphy becomes extremely complex. Stratigraphy shows that by about 1000 before our era the Sahara was already a desert. 22. J. Chabalone, 1964. 23. H. 4, 1962. 24. P. Cameron, 1969-70. 588. The Prehistory of the Sahara. Solid Prithral Studies on Algeria, 25 Morocco, 26 Libya, 27 and so on. In the light of such studies we can get a fairly accurate idea of the outlines of Saharan prehistoric chronology. but there are too few paleontological data and, in general, too little organic material that can be used for radiocarbon dating for us to take an absolute chronology any further back than the Neolithic. See Table 23.1, page 600. Though of course Table 23.1 is drastically simplified, and in particular it does not account for an important complex of large flakes, often made by the Levallois technique, found on top of a collection of thin, bifacial flakes, small in size and light in weight, that probably date from the end of the Acheulean. Such complexes have been found at Tigwell-Cameen, 28 at Burku, 29 and other places. Finally, we should point out that up till now nothing has been found that would enable us to speak of an Upper Paleolithic 30 period in the Sahara, since the term is not borne out by the facts. Still less is it possible to talk of a Mesolithic period, although in any case that particular term is going out of use. Table 23.1 meters away perhaps give rise to a more detailed chronology. It correlates what is known of climatic trends and population densities in prehistoric times. Although very few skeletons have been found together with industries which will allow of classification, yet those that have been found indicate the very great antiquity of man in the Sahara. The appearance of man in the Sahara, the pebble culture industry and the banks of extinct rivers. It is often possible to see terraces that were formed when the waters were still flowing. Such terraces form three distinct levels, called, for the sake of convenience, old, middle and late terraces. At Jebel Ibzarani, 120 kilometers east of Insalon in the Algerian Sahara, pebble tools have been found in the old terrace. We know that such pebbles are the first tools to bear recognizable marks of having been worked by man. In most cases they are simply river pebbles from which a few flakes have been struck to fashion the rough, uneven cutting edge. It has been postulated 25 L. Below, 1955 b. 26. P. Biberson, 1961 b. 27. C. B. M. McGurney and R. /V. Hay, 1955. 28. H. J. Hugot, 1962. 29. Hibbett. 30. Paleolithic. The recognition of Homo habilis as the probable ancestor of present-day man has necessitated a new chronological division of this period, but this has not modified the problems relating to the Sahara. It appears at present that there was no Middle Paleolithic or Epipaleolithic period in the Sahara, but rather the Terminal Paleolithic that is represented by the Aterian, therefore post-Mousterian and separated from the Neolithic by only a brief gap. 31. 8. Bonnet, 1961. 589. 3. Code. SCO. The prehistory of the Sahara. That such objects belong specifically to the industries of Homo habilis. In the Saharan region of Niger, on the banks of the Tefetsasset, 32 an ancient tributary of Lake Chad, large quantities of pebble tools have also been found, but in a less significant situation than in Idjarani. Other collections, as in Adalef, 33 have been scattered or destroyed, while the series found in the Satter of 34 is too small to provide sufficient material for study. But we can say for certain that the pebble culture was widely found throughout the Sahara, which at that time was humid and very different from the desert we know today. Unfortunately no animal or human fossils from this period have been discovered, and all we can do is to put forward the hypothesis that these very rough tools, which are found more or less throughout the Sahara as well as at sites where large quantities remain, really are those that were fashioned and used by our most distant ancestors. Homo erectus, maker of bifacial tools. At the close of the pebble culture a technical change appears leading to the evolution of tools which were still in use at the beginning of the Lower Paleolithic. The mystery surrounding this great human and technical advance remains complete. In the Sahara no skeleton of the makers of this remarkable tool and of the derivative form, the cleaver, which suggests a forest environment at that period, has been found. But although we know nothing of the ecology of the pebble culture, we are slightly better informed on that of Homo erectus. The Sahara was then a region of great lakes with high water levels and sufficient rainfall to maintain a type of vegetation indicative of an almost cool climate. The large animals NOW found only south of the desert then lived throughout the Sahara. One remarkable fact is that the torrential downpours typical of the following period destroyed or severely damaged the deposits of sediment which accumulated almost everywhere in the Great Lakes, and moreover the very dry spell between the preceding period and the period under discussion in a white well have hastened the process of destruction. Because of the widespread disturbance of these deposits, reliable stratigraphy evidence is extremely rare, although the number of bifacial tools found in the Sahara is enormous. We shall not go so far as to say that the fossil man of Chad 3-5 made bifacial tools. Vorfrey 36 puts him at the beginning of his chapter in the lower and middle Paleolithic in the Sahara, but since we have no knowledge as to 32. H. J. Hugot, 1962, pages 151-2. 33. H. J. Hugot, 1955b. 34. J. Chabellone, 1956. 35. Y. Cottons, 1962, pages 455-9. 36. R. Vorfrey, 1969, page 21. 591. Methodology and African Prehistory. Whether this venerable ancestor made tools, we can only describe him as an extremely interesting paleontological discovery. Tehudain was first mentioned by Puvarar in 1864-37 and was visited by E. F. Gautier and M. Regas in 1932. 38. The Endashuli an industry has been found there with remains of rhinoceros, elephants, hippopotamuses, bovines, buffalo, warthogs, zebra, crocodiles, gazelle, and so on. All the material in Tehudain is late Acheulean, and it often includes carved bone or wood, so that it was at advanced stage of the Acheulean and does not follow directly from the culture already described. Not far from Tehudain there are two very fine Acheulean deposits with a variety of bifacial tools, often very small and almost S-Bakin, and of cleavers. This is the Adieberg deposit, 39, discovered by a soldier in 1934 and first published by H. L. Hope and H. Kelly in 1936. 40. This surface deposit, like the one at Wadi Teketses at 41 discovered by the Brilliant Genera expedition, is not easily dated, but their importance has not inspired the research necessary to get full value from the material. Tubelbala and Tachfianga 42 are well known for their bifacial tools in reddish quartzite sandstone, and more especially for their impressive range of cleavers that show a highly developed technique. In the same part of Africa, J. Chabellone and H. Alamet have found an undisturbed deposit of a developed Acheulean culture which either immediately preceded the flake industry or else should be included in the middle Acheulean. This is the case at Mazur, Beni Abbas and Kurzes. 43. At Chibikat Menau the Sahara in the Algerian Sahara. 44. There would be a significant series of artifacts except that, unfortunately, they are very few. At Inekar, Minuet and Iraq. 45. The middle Acheulean is buried under sediment containing scattered objects of the Aterian. A large number of Acheulean objects have also been found at Adalef, 46 at Shirta, 47 at El Base, 48 at Eshahainig, 49 in the western Sahara at 37. H. Buvarar, 1864. 38. E. F. Gautier and M. Regas, 1934. 39. H. L. Hope and H. Kelly, 1936, pages 217-26. 40. This surface stratum is a good illustration of the difficulties of distinguishing between the dominant industry and later contamination by more recent objects. 41. H. J. Hugot, 1962. 42. B. Champald, 1953. 43. H. Aliment, I 960, pages 421-3. 44. J. Chabellone, 1956, page 231, 1958, pages 431-43. 45. H. J. Hugot, 1963. 46. /V. P. Fonte et al., 1938, pages 17-21. 47. M. Allenite, 1948. 48. P. Biberson, 1965, pages 173-89. 49. 8. J.R. Kell, 1954, pages 30-4. 592. The Prehistory of the Sahara. Target, 50 and in the Libyan Desert. 51. We may conclude that the Acheulean is present in the whole Sahara, but we are unable to date it for, apart from 4 or 5 sites, no stratigraphy deposits have been found. The most important were careful excavations and observations remains to be done. An obscure point, the flake industries both in Europe and in the Sahara. The Lower Paleolithic is characterized by the basic bifacial tool, which began in extremely rough forms that were at first called chalene, and developed into elegant, balanced, perfectly chipped and finished pieces like those found at Mikok. In the Sahara the precursors of bifacial tools are small worked pebbles, but we soon find a radical change in the techniques used in stone flaking, and to this new mastery of the difficult art of stone preparing the refinement and perfection of form is partly due. In Europe and the Sahara such progress was made possible only by the discovery of the virtues of using the more pliable striker, made of bone or wood, rather than a stone hammer, which could not be used with great precision because of the force of impact it required. But although the bifacial tool is in a sense the characteristic, or fossil director of the Lower Paleolithic, it is far from being the only object made by Homo erectus. We have many reasons for believing that as soon as the technique was evolved flakes were used too, and also a large number of the many chips that came off the core. That is why it is quite normal to find the preponderance of flake tools at the dawn of the Middle Paleolithic. 52. The flake tool is thus a development rather than a discovery, the development which also takes the form of reducing bifacial tools in size as well as using them more and more as weapons. On the other hand, what is revolutionary is the widespread use of the levallois technique. It appears very early in the Sahara, and influenced the techniques used in the making of certain bifacial tools from Tachi Edgat, 53 as well as Atburku and Timbro-Urine. But despite the very early appearance of the levallois technique, it does not seem to have changed the style of life of its inventors, who were certainly not Neanderthal men, or they would have adopted a different style of life requiring lighter tools and weapons, quite opposite in conception to the heavy bifacial tool and cleaver. The really striking fact, although it has hardly been noticed, is not so much the absence of any Mousterian or Mousteroid period in the Sahara, but that the Aterian period that takes its place, and which in fact has a Mousterianizing influence, is above all an industry providing weapons for hunting. The ability to make a tanged weapon implies not only that the concept of a shaft was known, but also 50. M. Almagro Bash, 1946. 51. G. Caden Thompson, 1952. 52. However, we should not forget that the real mutation is human, and is marked by the appearance of Neanderthal men, the instigator of the Mousterian industries. 53. J. Teixier, 1957. 593. Methodology and African Prehistory. Those of the Assegai and the Bulis. In brief, it is the industry of a migratory people, which is why its implements are so light compared with those of preceding cultures. At the present stage of research it would appear therefore that in the Sahara the Aterian 54 takes the place occupied elsewhere by the Mousterian, and shares several of its features such as the use of the levallois technique, which appears not only in the style of retouching but also in the typology of the finished objects. However, the Aterian differs from the Mousterian into essential characteristics, by the presence of tanged objects that might serve as boring instruments, either retouched or in a rough form, scrapers, balls or even drills, two noticeable statistical differences from the classical Mousterian industry. Apart from this, however, the idea of a Mousteroid substratum remains strong, and although we have no Aterian skeletons it is quite usual to attribute this interesting industry to a relation of Neanderthal men. We note that the Aterian is a North African industry that was diffused southwards 55 and stopped roughly along the banks of the Great Lakes of the southern Sahara. As it progressed southwards it gradually changed until it produced such works as the dazzling culture of Adler Booz, 5-6 word as well as the classical collection of coarse blades, flakes, scrapers, notches, double foliated arrowheads made by the bifacial technique and stone balls. We find very fine hafted arrowheads also made by the bifacial technique, one of which is nearly 19 centimeters long. The At culture is extremely widespread. We find it in Tunisia, 57 Morocco, 58 Algeria, 59 Salaro, Tidikel where it uses an Arankari fossil successfully as a basic material, 60 and Mauritania where Adder roughly marks its limits. 61 We find it everywhere, in a haggard 62 at the ADM. 54 At an industry of North African origin, with an essentially Mousterian basis and in addition a series of hafted objects. The At is a later culture than the Mousterian. The stone tools, which showed a marked influence of the Levallois technique, become more highly developed as it moved across the Sahara. The southernmost limit of the At seems to have been the Great Southern Lakes that are now found only in Chad. And the northwest borders of Chad sites dating from 9000 to 8000 before our era have been found. This industry dates from the late rather than the middle Paleolithic. 55. H. J. Hugot, 1967, pages 529 to 56. 56. H. J. Hugot, 1962, pages 158 to 62. 57. M. Gruet, 1954. 58. M. Antoine, 1938. 59. M. Regas, 1922, pages 467 to 72. 60. E. Jeff Gautier, 1914, Miner de Saint Martin, 1908, M. Regas, 1923. 61. R. Gitat, 1972, pages 29 to 33. 62. H. J. Hugot, 1962, pages 47 to 70. 594. The Prehistory of the Sahara. Berg, 63 at Tehoudain, 64 at Adder Booz, 65 and also in the Fezzan, in Zamril, and at its most easterly point at Karga in Egypt. 66. It is very difficult to place the At in a chronological sequence. It may have begun c. 35000 before our era. And the borders of Chad, its progress seems to have been arrested by the last high water level, and if that were the case then it would have lasted till 9000 to 7000 before our era. But all this is mere hypothesis. It seems logical that an industry so obviously influenced by the Mousterian should be succeeded by an Upper Paleolithic period, but two questions then arise. First, can we really put the At which did after all come very late, in the Middle Paleolithic? In his masterly thesis, L. Balabolka thought it would be wrong to succumb to such a temptation. Secondly, what do we know of a true At Paleolithic in the Sahara? Very little really, and the industry discovered by R. Muny at Wadi Esht 67 has not yet yielded up its secrets. The Capsian style collections of stone tools found on the southern border of the Tadmite 68 are still a matter of much debate. Only the series at Merdij al-Mawadi on the Tadmite Plateau in the central Algerian Sahara, which was found long ago, gives any proof of the presence of a true Capsian ensemble in the region now covered by the Sahara, and that is hardly enough to carry a conviction. In order to provide a chronological solution, it has therefore been suggested that the At should be placed under the uncontroversial heading of Terminal Paleolithic. The hiatus in order to describe a developed post-At industry of Adder Booz Niger J.D. Clark recently used the word Mesolithic. This term, which is, fortunately, gradually falling into disuse, has no meaning generally speaking, and does not correspond to anything known in the Sahara. Its use can only reinforce Arkel's error, 69, which was quite understandable at the time when he was working on the Nile. In the current state of research, French prehistorians prefer not to use this term. But this does not mean that the problem of the At Paleolithic does not exist, for the Egyptian civilization with its intrusive geometric microliths, 7 degrees precedes the Neolithic though without merging with it, and there are some. 63. J. Bobo, 1956, pages 253 to 68. 64. L. Balabolka, C. There Aberge and L. Balabolka, 1955, pages 287 to 92. 65. H. J. Hugot, 1962, pages 158 to 62. 66. G. Caden Thompson, 1952, 1946. 67. An unpublished monograph has been given to the Department of Prehistory of the IFVN of the University of Dakar. 68. H. J. Hugot, 1952, 1955 8. 69. 8. J. R. Kell, 1949 8, 1953. 70. E. Vineyard, 1923, pages 1 to 76. 595. Methodology and African Prehistory. Indications, though these are rare, that it may have spread farther than the zones where its presence has been recognized. The Neolithic we know little or nothing of the genesis of the Neolithic peoples. 71. They seem to have spread through the Sahara from different points. According to M. C. Chamblet, 7 to 1 factor in the Neolithic peopling of the Sahara is crossbreeding, with blacks at one extreme and Middle Eastern peoples, ordinarily grouped under the name Mediterranean, at the other. The Neolithic population of the Sahara was far from homogeneous. If we take the waves of settlement in order, the oldest seems to be that which formed on the banks of the Nile, near Khartoum and Eshehaini, and then spread westwards along the banks of the Great Lakes. This way does not seem to have spread farther than the eastern fringes of Akkar, nor to have penetrated into the forests, but it did send out to feelers northwards, one into the Haggard as far as the northern edge of the mountains before Tassili Najj, and the other from Tiamsi towards the Sahara. This brilliant civilization is easily recognized from the distinct character and the richness of its pottery decoration. Its industries, however, are very difficult to describe precisely, as the Neolithic of Sudanese tradition made use of all that came to hand. The first inhabitants of the Sahara were fishing, hunting, food gatherers, who were fond of hippopotamus and the berries of the nettle tree Keltisespi, but who did not disdain fish from the lakes, freshwater turtles, or watermelons. The fact that they made adzes, hoes, grinders, grindstones and similar objects does not mean at all that they engaged in any form of agriculture. 73. Though they constantly filled jars. 71. Neolithic, descriptive of new techniques, in particular pottery, stone polishing, the beginnings of domestication, agriculture and urbanism that supplemented the highly developed lithic industry of the Paleolithic. The oldest Neolithic sites in the Sahara can, it seems, be attributed to the 5th and 6th millennia before our era. The term Neolithic does not necessarily presuppose a knowledge of all the techniques mentioned above. However, one of the most remarkable phenomena, which merits some consideration, is the cooking of food. The chemical changes resulting from this had a decisive influence on the physiological development of man. The Saharan Neolithic in its various forms is a technical explosion, rather than a revolution as it has often been called. 72. M. C. Chamblet, 1968. 73. Agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of selected plants on areas of land worked specifically for that purpose. We may deduce that a culture had a knowledge of agriculture from the following: 1. Statistically valid palynological proof. 2. The existence of traces of cultivated land. 3. The discovery of identifiable vegetable fossils. The presence of a so-called agricultural range of tools is not in itself significant, as hoes may have been used to dig up clay for pottery, grindstones may have been used for grinding pigments, wild grains, medicines, etc. Agricultural is therefore a term that can only be applied in accordance with its fixed rules and not on the basis of unverified hypotheses. 596. The prehistory of the Sahara, with nettle tree berries, and though imprints of gourd seeds are often found during the excavation of sites, this gives rise at most to the hypothesis of a proto-cultivation. There was a division of labor for specialized pursuits divided up into specialized tasks. Stone polishing was widespread, and the range of weapons was extensive. Hunters used bows and slash or throwing spears, bone harpoons and fish hooks were used. Polished stone axes, hoes and adzes formed an important part of their equipment. They were adept at making beads from hard stones such as amazonite, chalcedony, hematite and carnelian. Specialists had perfected very clever drilling equipment, 74 consisting of burin splinters, needles and drills used with resins and fine sand. A lot of grinding equipment has been found, and it is often very fine. It proves that even if there was no true milling, at least the art of grinding was known. The product that they ground was certainly ochre, but also perhaps wild grains, berries, dried grasses, vegetable dyes, or medicines. Their pottery deserves special mention, not only for its richness of decoration but also for its beauty of form. It should be noted that conical dimple bases and elongated amphora-shaped vessels are not found, though there are a few pouring lips, handles and knobs. We are quite well informed, therefore, on the first wave of settlers. It was followed, farther to the south, by another African people which spread into the forests, where it was so well hidden that despite its importance this Neolithic culture remained for long undiscovered. It has been identified quite clearly in Guinea, hence its name of Guinean Neolithic, though in fact it probably originated in Central Africa. 75 A little later the Neolithic in the Capsian tradition, the result of the Neolithization of the old North African Capsian culture, began moving southwards. It reached Mauritania from the northeast, and got as far as Haggard, since at Mean yet it has been found just below the surface on Sudanese Neolithic sites. We are less certain of its eastern limits, as there are no usable monographs for Libya. The Capsian Neolithic tradition is more austere than the Sudanese Neolithic. Its pottery has little, if any, decoration. But while the Sudanese lithic industry is often hackneyed, the Capsian uses a very rigorous technique and in the Sahara is enriched with a dazzling proliferation of weapons and arrowheads. The polished stone is often very beautiful, and the bowls made from hard stone and zoomorphic statuettes 76 are masterpieces that quite make up for the bad impression made by their pottery. In this species of Neolithic culture we find small beads pierced for threading that are sometimes fragments of enchronite, but more often discs made out of small pieces of ostrich eggshell. Whole eggs have been blown to make containers, and some have been engraved with line drawings. 74. M. and J. Goskin, 1965, page 237. 75. R. Dielcroix and R. Vorfrey, 1939. 76. Collections Préhistoriques. Musée Ethnographie et de Préhistoire du Bardo, Alger Album No. 1 Paris, BMG, 1956 Plates 107 to 10. 597. Figure 23.2 Pottery from Akrijat, Mauritania. 598. The Prehistory of the Sahara. We note that the Ibero-Maurusians and the Capsians were not the same people. The latter lived mainly on the high Algerian plateaus where they left those strange heaps of shells known as escargotières. The Ibero-Maurusians settled on the shores of the Mediterranean, from Tunisia to Morocco, but we do not know for certain how these Cro-Magnioids settled in North Africa, nor how the two peoples were distributed. What is certain is that both underwent Neolithization in North Africa. The Ibero-Maurusian Neolithic people, living as they did near the sea, could not but be influenced by it, and if one continues south down the Atlantic coast of Morocco one finds mounds of mussel and oyster shells, and farther on of Variacinellus, which are still eaten in Senegal. The whole coast of the Moroccan Sahara and of Mauritania was occupied by a strange Neolithic industry that has been studied little if at all, and is characterized by rough pottery with little decoration, hearthstones and occasional stone tools. It would be very interesting to know how this industry was formed and where it came from, for although it was influenced by the Ibero-Maurusian culture in Morocco we know nothing of its constituent elements. There is a fifth stream of Neolithic culture that has since drawn the attention of specialists, the one discovered at Aberystwyth and called Tenerian for that reason. J.D. Clark, WHO has actually seen the site, suggested that it might be representative of the Seneran Neolithic, but this is quite impossible unless Seneran is taken merely to mean a very extensive area. The Tenerian, discovered by Joubert in 1941, 77 is characterized by lotus-shaped projectile points, thick concave scrapers, elementary saws and hafted axes as well as by its typology and statistical composition, and it is, again, impossible to call it a classical Saharan Neolithic culture as that term is reserved exclusively for the two cultures, Sudanese and Capsian, which cover most of the Sahara. Vorfrey, WHO was often tempted to relate everything to the Capsian Neolithic. 78 says that the Egyptian influences that can be recognized in the Algerian Sahara spread, in their most highly perfected form, as far as the Haggard, and, further on, the Tenerian sites represent the apex of the Saharan Neolithic industry and evoke irresistibly the pre-dynastic Egyptian culture. 79 We should however point out that outside Tenra there is no clear Egyptian influence to be found, despite Warfree's assertion. We still have to find out, therefore, how the obvious outside influences reached the magnificent Tenerian industry with its characteristic beautiful green jasper artifacts. One should however be careful not to take the notion of a fasci too far. Know with what varied exuberance the particular people may respond to the different limitations placed on it by such factors as the 77 G. Joubert and R. Warfree, 1941-6. 78 R. Warfree, 1938, pages 10-29. 79 R. Warfree, 1969, page 66. 599. Methodology and African Prehistory. TBL 23.1 Outline. 1002 plus 1000. 1002 negative 2000. 2002. 5000. 5002. 7000. 7002. 15,000. Of Saltaran prehistoric chronology. Last wet period. Silting up of tributary beds. Drying up of springs. First wells. Subsidence of alpine microclimates. Last glacial erosion of valleys. Reeds growing in lakes. Ancient dunes, type II. Akar. Final level of Great Lakes containing diatoms. Silures, elephant, hippopotamus, rhinoceros. Torrential rainfall. Ancient dunes, type I. Volcanic activity. Ferruginization of conglomerates. And erosion. Formation of tectosacite terraces. Flowing of great rivers. Formation of great lakes. Violent erosion. So-called pre-Islamic monuments. Recent Neolithic. Tisha. Phaetlion. Borkau. Early Neolithic. Minyet. Ingezum. Tilemsi. Atiran. Satiro. Tidikelt. Mauritania. Air. Ashuli and IIVII as established by Bigerson 1061. Pebble culture. Ecology, the subsoil and the minerals which are found in it, and where the presence of jasper and flint MOY result in masterpieces in stone. Quite different results will be obtained where the only material is a fragile sandstone. Hagerer Booz and Gossalarum 80 are the same, but one has to study the pottery, the discs and the axes in order to realize this. For all that the two industries having COMMON is the quality of the stone working. A few words remain to be said and a very fine Neolithic fasci found in southeast Mauritania along the course of the Dartiship. 81 Extensive excavation in this region has shown that this rather late industry is linked. 80 H. J. Hugot, 1962, pages 154-63 and 168-70. 81 H. J. Hugot et al., 1973. 600. The Prehistory of the Sahara. To an exceptional group of dry stone villages which are of great interest because of the extent of urbanization. 82 And the skill in fortification which they show. Here at last we have proof that from 1500 before our era the local communities ate millet, and so for once we see some sense in the enormous amount of grinding equipment found in the ruins of these villages. The Dartiship culture is African, as can be seen from its pottery and other characteristics. It may have come from the east, most likely from neighboring Tilemsi, but that is only a working hypothesis. It may thus be seen that the Neolithic involved a number of influential secondary currents acting on a COMMON foundation which can be identified in the pottery and less often from the particular techniques used in their stone or bone industries. The Neolithic can be regarded as lasting from 5000 before our era to about the beginning of the first millennium before our era, during which period the level of the lakes constantly sank, until eventually the varied large fauna retreated to the edges of the desert, especially to the south. The flora dwindled, and man in his turn emigrated with his herds. The fauna of this period were inherited from the Atiran, which ended when the lakes were at their last high level. On the shores and in the waters of these lakes were found the so-called Ethiopian fauna, which included rhinoceroses, crocodiles, crocodilus, nilodicus, hippopotamuses, elephants, zebra, giraffes, buffaloes and warthogs. Catfish sea areas and Nile perch lakes nilodicus teemed in the waters. as did freshwater turtles trionyx, while the pastures were graced by goats and antelopes. The only surprising thing about such a catalogue is that it applies to the Sahara. The flora is even more staggering. At the beginning of the Neolithic, the hazel, the limetree, the willow and the ash were still to be found. The Limicolouse shell found at Minya, that wider in the Algerian Sahara, indicates an annual rainfall of at least 500 millimeters, and that heather covered parts of the mountains. However, this vegetation soon dwindled and was replaced by one characteristic of a more arid zone with cedars, the Aleppo pines, junipers, olives and the gum and nettle trees that were such an important feature in the diet of the population. The lakes were also well provided with shellfish, and in some places the remains of enormous collections of Unio shells are found. Handy of the characteristics of the Sahara at the beginning of the Neolithic culture was the string of lakes all isolated from each other. The Sudanese Neolithic populations tended to migrate along the shores of the lakes, which offered suitable sites for settlements as well as varied food resources. 82. Urbanism, the study of the layout of a group of dwellings, usually occupied by a sedentary population and precisely organized according to the division of labor and religious ideas of the occupants. The only Saharan group that conforms to this definition is Dartiship in Mauritania, a settlement that began in about 2000 before our era. 601. Methodology and African prehistory. The Sahara, the cradle of agriculture. The idea that the Sahara was a cradle of agriculture has been put forward on a number of occasions, often without considering that this might be a misuse of such a significant term. Agriculture cannot be said to be proved by the presence of tools or other objects of possible agricultural application. Proof is provided only when fossil grains or pollens bear out the hypothesis put forward concerning the application of tools or objects. Collections of millet grains found at Tiship in Mauritania confirm Munson's 8.3 and Donno's 8.4 ideas on this subject. Apart from that, we know that the Saharan Neolithic people collected large quantities of berries, keltizeski, and nettle tree berries, which they certainly used for food, and at Minyet and Tiship cucurbitaceae seeds, probably of watermelons though not citrulus colocynthis, have been found. These two plants provide the staple of food gathering or, at the most, indications of proto-cultivation, but not of agriculture, which means preparing the soil deliberately in order to grow selected plants. In this definition we do not have much evidence to offer. That Minyet, 85 palynological analysis of Neolithic deposits has thrown no precise light on the existence of any form of agriculture. That Adberbu's a summary analysis gave no results either, not at Ben Asako, nor at any of the many sites studied from this point of view. The only remains found in Neolithic sites that showed for certain the vegetable products were eaten are seeds of Zizapus lotus, keltizeski, and various types of wild grain. To these we should also add the imprints of Panacetum found by Munson and the millet grains discovered at Tiship in fossilized turf. But before any conclusions can be drawn, we must await the systematic analysis of the Neolithic deposits. Despite its enormous potential, palynology has been little used in the Sahara, but even if some plants were cultivated there, it seems unlikely that it was a spot where conditions favored the development of the cereals commonly consumed in North Africa. It was, almost everywhere, stock raisers who, long ago, succeeded the hunter-gatherers, and the fact that stone tools such as hoes, grindstones, grinders, weights for balancing digging sticks, and picks have been found more or less everywhere does not ipso facto imply that agriculture in any real sense existed. In Egypt, where agriculture was extensively developed, very precise traces are found, and in such places as Tiship in Mauritania, where the sedentary population may well have practiced agriculture, such traces are also to be found. But, according to the present state of No. 83. P. J. Munson, 1968, pages 6 to 13. 84. T. Morneau, 1963. 85. G. P.M. Flamand, 1921. 602. The prehistory of the Sahara. Ledge, the situation is unlikely to have been the same elsewhere, and we should not forget that by before our era the Sahara was almost completely desert. But although the ending of the wet period hardly encouraged agriculture, this does not mean that all proto-cultivation, or the selective food gathering that preceded it, were unknown. Moreover, we may be certain that experimenting with vegetable foods must have stimulated the search for particular species, which, in itself, was an early form of selection. But cultivation is only possible among a population that is sedentary, or at least seasonally fixed, and in most of the Sahara the Neolithic period at its height is more reminiscent of nomadic encampments than of organized villages, though some of these certainly existed. The origins of domestication and the Neolithic Sahara had its own way of life. The stock raisers of Tassili and Ajj were contemporaries of the artists of the flying gallop chariots. Although their exact period is not known, they probably lived at about the time when the invading peoples of the sea were repulsed. Then they tried to conquer Egypt. In any event, these stock raisers developed the art of herding to such an extent as often to surprise the uninitiated, for, at its height, this civilization had developed such skillful methods of managing stock as to presuppose a long experience. The Egyptians seem to have tried to domesticate many kinds of animal, but we can only tell this from bas-reliefs. Without them we would never have known that they tried to tame members of the feline and canine families, gazelles and even hyenas. What was the situation in the Sahara? The Sudanese Saluki, that invaluable helper of the Nemadi hunters, seems to be of very ancient stock, and it is probably the Saluki that is depicted in the paintings of the stock-raising peoples. There are also other indications, but none of them conclusive. We know that in 2000 before our era both cattle and dogs were found in Akkar, but the rock paintings do not show which animals MN might have attempted to domesticate in earlier periods. The Neolithic way of life. We know that the people of the Sudanese Neolithic were endlessly curious about new techniques. They continued working stone and produced a marvelous range of arrowheads and tools, usually very light, made of flint flakes that had been retouched in various ways, balls, several forms of scraper, geometrical microliths, saws, and so on. What is new is the subtle stone polishing technique used for axes, hoes, gouges and chisels. Hard stone vessels, Amazonite, cornelian and quartz beads and small balls that may have been used in slingshots were added to their range of artifacts. We also find a profusion of fixed grindstones and grinders, which are not. 603. Methodology and African prehistory. Necessarily a proof of a knowledge of agriculture, and of kilowatts, the stones once used for weighing down digging sticks that are still in use in South Africa and among the Pygmies. The collection is completed by a dazzling series of pottery vases, already typical of the later art of Africa south of the Sahara in shape and decoration. Bone was also worked and was used for making harpoons, balls, needles, potter's combs, smoothers and maybe daggers. The people of the Sudanese Neolithic made the best possible use of the lithic resources wherever they lived, and this led to the idea that they came from several different ethnic stocks. But in fact theirs was a stable and united culture, as is proved by the unity of inspiration in their pottery decorations if by nothing else. We should also add that these peoples, already molded by certain types of social organization, must have known how to manage boats, and it is not impossible that they may have sailed on the lakes in reed boats like those still found in Chad and called Kobe. The people of the Capsian Neolithic differ in many ways from their Sudanese counterparts and predecessors. The latter left the Sudan in several waves, going westward but not, it seems, reaching the Atlantic coast. They were black-skinned, often true Africans. But the people that set out from the high plateaus of Algeria were more Mediterranean, and they had inherited from their Capsian ancestors a real gift for flint working. They had an astonishing range of tools. Fine flakes on which the working is hardly visible are often reminiscent of jewelry. Balls, sharp points and little scrapers are found along with geometrical microliths made from the waste of the flaking process in the shape of trapezes, rectangles, triangles and segments of circles. They were not ignorant of hunting, since they made innumerable arrowheads that have now unfortunately become the object of a large-scale tourist trade. There is an abundance of polished axes, but they are not compact and squat as is usual in the Sudanese Neolithic. The Capsian culture had a wider range of stone tools than the Sudanese, and also used far more varied techniques. They too knew how to polish hard stone bowls and to make marvelous sculptures like the Bull of Silat, the Ram of Tamentit and the Gazelle of Imakasan. But their pottery is far less rich in form and decoration, not because the artists lacked imagination. Their skill in decorating ostrich eggs which they used, whole, as containers and, broken into bits, to make innumerable beads proves that this is not the case. Fragments of ostrich shell exist decorated with fine line drawings. They also, of course, had fixed grindstones and grinders, and we know for certain that some of these were used for grinding pigments, probably for painting their bodies. The Neolithic of the coast is little known. The work done on this subject has not yet been published, but we do know that all along the Atlantic coast from Morocco southwards countless shell mounts have been found, some of them veritable tells, mixed up with ashes and potsherds. This is true as far down as Senegal, at which point the proto-historic ethnic movement seems to have taken over. It still remains too. 604. The prehistory of the Sahara be explained why at the frontier between Mauritania and the Rio de Aro the round, or flat-bottomed pottery COMMON in the Sahara is replaced by a marvelous pottery with distinctly conical bases. As yet, however, nothing has been published on this problem. Farther east, at Agar in Air, there is a stratum that cuts right through all the other known aspects of Saharan Neolithic cultures, whatever their origin. This is the Tenarian. Using bright green jasper to make quite magnificent tools, many of the shapes found are reminiscent of the Egyptian Neolithic. It is true that common forms such as flat discs, low touch-tapped projectile points, nip scrapers known as crescents, and hoes polished by use might just be coincidental, but they occur so often that this seems unlikely. Certain fixed grindstones associated with this brilliant culture are similar to those found in Egyptian bas-reliefs, so that one is almost led to believe that Agar was colonized by people who had close links with the Nile, although it is strange that they used pottery similar in all respects to the Sudanese Neolithic. We should not forget, however, that the latter has its archetypes at Eshkehini. During an epoch that was more humid than today, the forests south of the line of lakes must have been greener and denser than they are now, and this may explain the fact that the people of the Sahara never crossed this barrier. The study of the Neolithic culture of these forests has hardly begun. For purposes of convenience and precedence it has been called Ghanaian, but in fact it seems to have originated much farther afield, maybe even in Zaire. Conclusion: the fascinating study of the past of the Sahara is still taking its first halting steps, and it offers to specialists and to men of goodwill an opportunity that should be quickly seized, before the exploitation of its last natural resources destroys forever our chances of solving problems which, in the long run, concern the past of the whole of mankind. It is only by becoming aware of his past that in the end can determine his future. Our experience comes not only from the present but also in a direct line from prehistory. To deny this would be to deny that the study of prehistory is any rational basis or scientific value. The prehistory of the Sahara is no longer a matter for individual research. It is a collective enterprise, requiring teamwork and money. It is tragic to see scientific work on the Sahara so abandoned, so neglected. The people responsible for this huge and harsh desert should make themselves responsible for providing the men to discover its secrets. 605. Plate 23.1 Flat-notched axe from Gosalaram, Niger. Plate 23.2 Cleaver from Tiben Asako, Mali. Plate 23.3 Chopper tool pebble culture. Plate 23.4 Chopper tool pebble culture from Aleph, Algerian Sahara. From Aleph, Algerian Sahara. 606. Plate 23.5 Lower Paleolithic hand from Tachi Edgat, Algerian Sahara. Plate 23.7 Large bifacial double point, and industry, from Timi Mount, Algerian Sahara. Plate 23.6 Lower Paleolithic cleaver from Tachi Edgat, Algerian Sahara. 607. Plate 23.8 written points from Aleph, Algerian Sahara. 608. Plate 23.10 Neolithic pottery from Darteship, Mauritania. Plate 23.9 written bifacial double point from Agar V, Niger. 609. Plate 23.11 Neolithic arrowheads from Ingezim, Niger. Plate 23.12 Neolithic groove tacks from Agar Niger. Plate 23.13 Neolithic polished tacks from the Fonte region, Chad. 610. The prehistory of West Africa. C.T. Shaw. Climate and environment. The main climatic and vegetation belts run east and west across the whole expanse of West Africa. The highest rainfall occurs near the coast, and the farther north and inland one goes, the less it becomes. The HE Desert to the north is fringed along its southern edge by the dry Sahel Strip. South of this comes the Great Savanna Belt. Between the savanna and the wet tropical rainforest which fringes the coast lies a zone of derived savanna which was once forest but which has been turned into savanna by the activities of man. Rainfall in the area is markedly seasonal, falling predominantly from April to October with peaks in July and October in the south and from June to September in the north. These rains are carried on southwest winds which have gathered their moisture from the Atlantic. However, the intertropical front runs east and west across West Africa, dividing the tropical maritime air mass formed over the South Atlantic from the dry continental air mass over the Sahara. The HE position of the front fluctuates with the seasons of the year. In January it is farthest to the south, with the consequence that the northeast trade winds from the dry northern air mass reach right down to the Guinea coast, bringing with them the dramatic fall in humidity. The awareness of this weather and vegetation pattern is fundamental to the understanding of the prehistory and archaeology of West Africa. The location and extent of the different vegetation zones, and the position of the intertropical front, have varied at different times in the past, affecting the circumstances in which MN was living in West Africa at different periods. Set into these vegetation zones are a number of geographical features which make local modifications in the general pattern: the Fura-de-Gallant and Guinea Highlands, the Togo/Atacora Chain, the Barchi Plateau and the Mangarod/Cameroon Highlands, the inland delta of the Niger and its great northward bend, Lake Chad, and the delta at the mouth of the Niger. There is a break between Ghana and Nigeria in the continuity along the coast of the tropical rainforest belt, which is known as the Dahomey Gap. Forest, savanna, desert. XX. E80. 612. The prehistory of West Africa. Early man skeletal remains. West Africa has not so far produced remains of early forms of MN or hominids such as have been found in eastern and southern Africa, nor artifacts of correspondingly early date. Can it be assumed that there were such beings in West Africa? Is our present lack of data due to the fact that these hominids were not living at the time in West Africa, or is it simply because the evidence has not yet been found? This is a question which it is impossible to answer at present, but no research effort comparable to that in East Africa has yet been made in West Africa. It also has to be admitted that deposits of the right age appear to be scarcer in West Africa, and it is notorious that in the prevailing conditions of high humidity and soil acidity, preservation conditions are very much worse. 3. This fact is illustrated by data of a much later age. A distribution MP of Africa plotting finds of skeletal remains of the late Stone Age shows a complete blank in the Zaire West Africa area. 4. Yet since the compilation of HAT map, dated finds have been made in Nigeria and Ghana which show that the blank was indicative of a state of research, not of an absence of human occupation. 5. The same may then be true for the earlier period we are now considering. 6. And may also be true of a distribution MP of the fine places of vertebrate fossils of lower and middle Pleistocene age, which shows a similar blank. 7. As far as one can see, there must have been ecological conditions in certain parts of West Africa very similar to those which supported the Australopithecines of East Africa, but of course this does not mean that these areas in fact were occupied. There are many areas of tropical rainforest which could support gorillas today, but in fact they are only found in two circumscribed areas. 8. And in spite of some similarity of conditions, the West African savanna does not support the same collection of game types as East Africa, nor in the same density. 9. Any positive piece of evidence for thinking that early hominids were to be found in suitable areas of West Africa early in the Pleistocene is provided by the craniofacial portion of a skull found 200 kilometers west-southwest of Larcho. It was named Chabanterpus Atsaris, 10 and was first thought to be 1. R. E. F. Leakey, 1973 b. 2. M. Leakey, 1970. 3. J. D. Clark, 1968 a. page 37. 4. C. Gable, 1966, page 17. 5. C. T. Shaw, 1965 b. 1969 b. D. Broadwell and C. T. Shaw, 1971, C. Flight, 1968, 1970. 6. Y. Cottons, 1966b, page 373. 7. Hibbett, page 374. 8. J. P. Dorst and P. Dandelot, 1970, page 100. 9. Hibbett, pages 213, 223. 10. B. G. Campbell, 1965, pages 4, 9, 613. Methodology and African Prehistory. An Australopithecine 11 but was later regarded as more akin to Homo habilis. 12. The uncertainties in this case stem from the lack of secure dating and from the fact that the skull is only fragmentary. Further examination of the skull, with its combination of archaic and advanced characteristics, has suggested that it shows clear signs of evolving towards Homo erectus. 13. Representing a more advanced stage of the hominids, and has cranial capacities ranging from 850 cc to 1300 cc. Once again, there are no examples of this form from West Africa, although specimens of this type, called Atlanthropus mauritianus, have been found in Algeria. 14. Artifacts. Although prehistoric man made tools of bone and wood as well as of stone, wood is rarely preserved, and soil conditions in West Africa militate against the survival of bone. Apart from utilized and roughly trimmed planks, the earliest and simplest types of stone tools consist of pebbles or lumps flanked by percussion to form crude chopping and cutting tools with edges anything from 3 cm to 12 cm long. They are known as Old Dowan type tools, after Oldaway Gorgon, Tanzania. Such tools are found in many places in Africa, and the early men who made them may well have spread over most of the savanna bushy grasslands of Africa. Examples of such tools are known from a number of places in West Africa. 5. But it is not at the moment possible to be sure if any of them genuinely date from the same period as the Old Dowan industry of East Africa, which may be put in the period between 2 million and 0.7 million years ago. Careful investigation of pebble tools found along the Gambia River in Senegal demonstrated that some were likely to be of Neolithic origin and others to have derived possibly from the Late Stone Age. There was no stratigraphical evidence for an industry of pre-Acheulean H. 16, so we can only be sure that pebble tools belong to an early period if they are independently dated by being found in situ in deposits which can be dated, either relatively or absolutely. Paleontology gives some relative dating for the Ya'an deposits which produced Chabanthropus, but unfortunately, there were no associated implements. From the evidence of fossil bones of the extinct hippopotamus Maguncula which came from a depth of 58 meters in a well in Borneo, 17, it is likely that deposits of the Chad Basin contain paleontological material of Pleistocene age, and as likely as 11. Y. Cottons, 1961. 12. Y. Cottons, 1965. 8. 1965 B. H. B. S. Cook, 1965. 13. Y. Cottons, 1966 A. 14. C. Aberge and Art Hofstetter, 1954, 1955. C. Aberge, 1954, 1966. 15. O. Davies, 1961, pages 1 to 4, 1964, pages 83 to 91. Armani, 1963. R.C. Soper, 1965, page 177. H. J. Hugot, 1966 B. 16. Armani, 1968, page 1283. C. Bardi and C. Descamps, 1969. 17. C. M. Tatam, 1944, page 39. 614. The Prehistory of West Africa. Not archaeological material as well, but it lies under a mantle of later drift of great thickness. Climatic changes in Europe. There were several different glaciations during the Quaternary, and the four principal ones were given the names of rivers in Germany. It is now realized, however, that whatever overall rhythm and pattern there may be in glacial phenomena, there are many local variations which have to be taken into account, with the result that local names are used for each particular region. The ensuing picture is one of a greater complexity but probably a lot nearer reality. 18. The same kind of thing happened when early research workers in Africa found evidence in reached lake levels, in erosions and in deposits of gravels which were taken to indicate that it dated from the Quaternary when the African climate was very much wetter than at present. Such periods of increased rainfall were christened pluvials. Since the concept of glacial periods was already evolved for the north temperate zones, what more natural than the idea that when there was a glacial period in Europe and North America there was a corresponding pluvial period in the warmer tropics. 19. In time, the idea of 3, and then 4, African pluvials became orthodox belief. 20. And it was supposed that they corresponded to the glaciations of the European Ice Age. 2. Although an alternative theoretical scheme was put forward suggesting that one African pluvial corresponded to 2 northern glaciations. 22. That it was possible to put forward the view of this kind illustrates how almost non-existent was any true chronological correlation. In any case, geological correlations over wide distances should be based not on climates, but on rock formations. In addition, the evidence for pluvial events is somewhat equivocal when compared with that for glaciations, and has caused much confusion. 23. In time, the very evidence for pluvials in Africa was called into question. 24. West Africa has been no exception to this pattern of extrapolation, and efforts have been made to use sequences derived from other parts of Africa to give meaning to data which are otherwise isolated or difficult to interpret. 25. More recently, however, 2 things have served to improve the scientific